She put the dress on for the first time on the morning of May 27th in her room. She had bought a special brassiere to go with it, which gave her breasts the proper uplift. Not that they actually needed it, but left their top halves uncovered. Wearing it gave her a weird, dreamy feeling that was half shame and half defiant excitement. Thus begins Chapter 2 of Carrie, the horror classic from Stephen King, a chapter which contains much violence, much destruction, much death, a lot of blood, and maybe even a little too much hope. Welcome to Strip Coverlet, where we squeeze the bigger picture out of literature. I'm Adrian Ford, and we are here for another video in the Carrie read-along series. This is a video which will contain 3 separate parts. Number 1, a So What Happened recap of the second chapter of the novel. Secondly, we will talk about the literary criticism there is to be had with this chapter. And finally, we will wrap things up with some writer's advice that we can garner from Stephen King in this chapter from the novel Carrie. And lastly, finally, we will have a little bit of the novel with some AI-generated art, which is actually some really stunning stuff that AI came up with for a little bit of description from this novel. So, what happened? Carrie's mother catches Carrie in her prom dress, and it goes about as well as you'd expect. Carrie then force pushes her out of the room. Then she waits, all the while doubting she'll actually have a date. But Tommy does show up and start calling her names. He calls her beautiful. Cut to Chris and Billy no gooding. They get up to go to the prom. Cut back to Tommy and Carrie, who arrive at the prom, and Carrie is a hit. Then we get a flashback of Billy setting the pig's blood to be spilled on the prom king and queen. Cut back to Carrie, who is coming into her own with wit and humor. Cut to Carrie's mom, who was real sorry she had not already killed Carrie a couple of times. Real Mom of the Year stuff. But it's okay, because now she's going to do so. At the prom, Carrie runs into Miss Desjardins, and they share a moment. Oh, hey, Carrie's mother starts sharpening a knife, but it's probably nothing. Back to the prom, where they are taking votes for king and queen. Carrie and Tommy tie for the win, so they hold a runoff vote, and hooray, Carrie and Tommy win by a single vote. Oh, what could have been? Cut to Sue at home as the alarm on the top of City Hall starts to sound. Back to the prom, where the buckets fall on Tommy and knocks him out. Maybe it kills him. It's probably nothing. Carrie runs out of the gym. Then she watches through the windows while she shuts the doors. Then she turns on the ceiling sprinklers. Anyway, the water ends up hitting the band's electrical equipment and electrocuting people, but Carrie is not impressed, so she pops out one of the light cables and dips it into the water on the ground. Boom! Electrical fire. Sue books it to the school as Carrie walks away from the school, on her way to the church to pray. Then she starts her journey toward Mama, who is waiting for Carrie, waiting to kill Carrie. She stabs Carrie, who then force stops Mama's heart. Billy and Chris try to go back into town, but Carrie catches them and runs their car into a building, making it catch fire. Then she collapses. That's where Sue finds her. They share a moment as Carrie learns Sue did not set her up. Then Carrie dies. The main sort of symbolism that seems to be popping up time and again in this novel is this sort of regime, if you will, of symbolism here. White versus red is the same as water versus blood, is the same as pure versus sullied. So anytime you see water, you think pure. Anytime you see pure, you think white. Anytime you see white, you think water. Anytime you see blood, you think red. Anytime you see red, you think sullied. Anytime you see something sullied, you think blood. And this seems to pop up time and again here on 142 when Mama is finding out about Carrie and her dress. She says, "Red," Mama murmured. "I might have known it would be red." Red being sinful, red being lustful, red being blood, red being sullied. Her mother, the very same page leading into 143, her mother reached up and pinched her own face. It left a red mark. So we have Mama White, because the last name is White, they're reaching up and pinching her own cheek and leaving a red mark. Another way to look at this is a type of self-harm, something like that, which is, of course, going to be a moment of aggression and lust, and impurity from Mama reaching up and pinching her own face. Then on 186, we have this. She laughed out loud, then clapped a hand over her mouth. The sound was almost entirely foreign to her. Before she could think, she circled their names, third from the top. The tiny pencil broke in her hand, and she gasped. A splinter had scratched the pad of one finger. A small bead of blood welled. Another occurrence of blood. Of course, the inciting incident of this novel is Carrie White starting her period in the showers. So you have both blood and red in the showers, which are water and purity. Then going forward onto 190 and 191, she looked at the cut. It bled slowly, thickly, from the open lips of the wound running out of her hand and spotting the worn linoleum of the kitchen floor. Good, then. It was good. The blade had tasted flesh and let blood. She did not bandage it, but tipped the flow over the cutting edge, letting the blood dull the blade's sharp glimmer. Then she began to sharpen again, heedless of the droplets which splattered on her dress. Another interesting time where... So, another way to think of this, you've heard the term, the gun is never just a gun. The gun is a phallic symbol. The cigar is a phallic symbol. The knife is a phallic symbol. Slitting flesh and penetrating the individual. So we have some interesting symbolism going on as far as the feminine versus the masculine and pure versus sullied going on there as well. And finally, from this chapter on this subject, on page 195, we have, of course, the school colors. With pride, we wear red and white. So the very school colors that Carrie White attends, the Thomas Ewan High, the colors for the school are red and white. An interesting way for Stephen King to really drive this point home. Moving on page 147, something that I thought was interesting. Of course, it would be easier to stay here with Mama. This is Carrie talking to herself. Safer. She knew what they thought of Mama. Well, maybe Mama was a fanatic, a freak. But at least she was predictable. The house was predictable. She never came home to laughing, shrieking girls who threw things. So this is one of the saddest elements of this novel, which is going to come back in the darkest element or the darkest detail for this novel, if I ever get around to making it, if I ever get around to doing anything, right, is the idea of hope. And Carrie is someone who is constantly talking herself out of hope. She's constantly talking herself out of feeling something. She's constantly talking herself out of believing she is worth something. She's constantly talking herself into believing that this world around her that is so sad, is the world that she deserves. This is, of course, a type of learned helplessness. This is, of course, something that people in this situation fall victim to all too often. It is something that once someone finds their way into that type of thinking, very difficult to escape from for the rest of their entire lives. Very rarely do people get out of those negative loops. Very sad thing, but a very realistic thing from Stephen King in this novel. Maybe I shouldn't jump off on this tangent, but that's one of the reasons that Stephen King's works like Holly, Stephen King's works like Fairy Tale, they're so sad to me because this was his very first novel that he really put out there, and it's so good on so many levels. And neither Holly nor Fairy Tale, in my opinion, had a single redeeming quality. I didn't like anything about either of those novels. So moving on to the third point here, just this is a little thing for me, again, something that makes this novel very sad for me. Stephen King seems to have a soft spot in his heart for Emily Dickinson, an author after my own heart. And we get something which can only be an allusion towards Emily Dickinson in this chapter. On 157, time enough to think of that later, maybe, when it would do something for her besides cause useless arousal. She swung her own legs over the edge of the bed and slid into gossamer panties. Gossamer is a very rare word in the English language. Just a page later, George Dawson and Frida Jason were standing by the Coke machine. Frida was in an orange tulle concoction. Tulle, a very rare word in the English language. This can only, this close together, be an allusion to one of the greatest poems of the English language, Because I Could Not Stop for Death, by Emily Dickinson, which, of course, I will take this opportunity to read. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves in immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too for his civility. We passed the school where children strove at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain. We passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer, my gown, my tippet, only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then, 'tis centuries and yet feel shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. Emily Dickinson, the greatest poet of the English language. You can argue, but you would be wrong. So the next thing to talk about here is something that pops up a little bit in this chapter, and it goes back to the religious overtones here. The abyss and hell. On 237, so the abyss and hell, in the Old Testament, the abyss is sort of the closest thing that we get to hell. Sheol is sort of the closest thing that we get to hell. We have here on 237, She had gone in only 5 minutes before after opening the gas main. It had been easy. As soon as she pictured it, it lay there under the street. It had been easy. But it seemed like hours. This is as Carrie is sort of going nuts. She had prayed long and deeply, sometimes aloud, sometimes silently. Her heart thudded and labored. The veins on her face and neck bulged. Her mind was filled with the huge knowledge of powers and of an abyss. So, this is interesting because it's one of the few insights that we really get to Carrie's use of powers. And that phrase there, her mind was filled with the huge knowledge of powers and of an abyss. This almost makes it seem as if the powers that she is drawing, as if those come straight from hell. This makes Mama White seem as if she's correct. Mama White, of course, this is a Carrie becomes essentially the same thing as a school shooter in this novel, right? Because of that, towards the end of the novel, Mama White is right, isn't she? Maybe she created the monster, but it's time for that monster to be put down. That monster became a monster. Here we have this idea again. When Carrie starts using her powers, her mother believes that there's something evil going on there. And here we have a little bit of the idea. Maybe that is correct. Carrie feels the power when she's using these powers, but she also feels an abyss. Very interesting. Later in that same paragraph, she prayed. So this is after she had gone to the church, after she had created all of this mayhem, after she had killed all of these people. This is a wow moment from this novel. She prayed, and there was no answer. No one was there, or if there was, it was cowering from her. God had turned his face away, and why not? This is a stark type of feeling in this novel, but again, praying and there is no answer, that is an abyss, that is a hollow where there was believed to be a something. The very next page, 238, the very top, first paragraph, she paused on the lower step, looking at the flocks of people streaming toward the center of town. Animals. Let them burn then. Let the streets be filled with the smell of their sacrifice. Let this place be called Raqqa, Ichabod, Wormwood. Here we have Carrie reigning in hell rather than serving in heaven. There is that old idea, would you rather reign in hell or serve in heaven? Here we have Carrie deciding to reign and preside over hell itself. And finally, on page 250, a little slower, Mama. Do you know what the present is, Mama? What you always wanted, darkness, and whatever God lives there. This is Carrie turning fully against her mother and her religion. With Carrie, these ideas are incredibly intertwined. For Carrie, these two ideas are essentially the same thing, and here she is saying that they are both bereft. Both her mother and her religion. Her mother and her mother's religion, the religion that has been passed down to her. They are bereft. There is nothing there in the least. Carrie herself has become more powerful than that religion, or so she feels. And the final thing I want to point to here is just maybe this should have been in the writer's corner portion of this, but It's just so good. It's just so good. This is as Carrie is sitting and waiting for her date to arrive. 7:33. Not coming. Then I'll wreck the house. The thought came to her naturally and cleanly. First, the sewing machine driven through the living room wall. The couch through the window, tables, chairs, books, and tracts, all flying, the plumbing ripped loose, and the house still spurting, like arteries ripped free of flesh. The roof itself, if that were within her power, shingles exploding upward into the night like startled pigeons. That turn from hurt to embarrassment to hurt to anger. That is just a really human moment in this novel. That is something that those turns of emotion that you can't explain, but you know they happen, right? You've been with someone who is very, very sad all of a sudden, and you know the next move is anger, is fury, is violence likely. So, yeah, just a very, very good moment here from Stephen King in this novel. Now, what can we take from this chapter of Carrie as writers? Well, there are some good lessons. Most of them are smaller lessons because it's very difficult to take big lessons from good writing. It's easier to take big lessons from bad writing. But there are a few cases of a little bit of bad writing here, and I want to start with this. So this is during the scene with the prom itself, and one of the things that can be difficult in a scene like that is you have a lot of movement, you have a lot of chaos, you have a lot of characters, and you don't want to have to know all of them, but you want to know quite a few of them, at least a little bit. Now, unfortunately, what often ends up happening in writing is that an author gets lazy with some of these things because it is easy to just slough past the stuff that doesn't matter. But this takes us out of what John Gardner calls the vivid and continuous dream. Good writing is a vivid and continuous dream state for your reader. Your reader is constantly envisioning everything that is going on, but bad writing takes the reader out of that. We have a little bit of that at the top of 193 when we get this statement. Where am I at here? Sorry. A robe with a lush dog fur collar was thrown over Carrie's shoulders, and they were being led down the center aisle by a boy and a girl in white blazers. That's serviceable, but a boy and a girl in white blazers does not make the event human. What about something like this? A robe with a lush dog fur collar was thrown over Carrie's shoulders, and they were being led down the center aisle by Brian something and a girl named Amanda or Emily. This way, we don't have to really know the characters, but it gives us the feeling that Carrie is familiar with them, and that's pretty much good enough. A boy and a girl in white blazers is so hands off, is so distant, that it makes it feel like fiction. But calling them by Brian something and a girl named Amanda or Emily makes them feel more like real people. Then we have just a really good scene on 197. This is Sue as the mayhem is unfolding, I believe. She went to the window, but slowly. The shrieking of the whistle rose and fell, rose and fell. Somewhere horns were beginning to blat, as if for a wedding. She could see her reflection in the darkened glass, lips parted, eyes wide, and then the condensation of her breath obscured it. A memory half forgotten came to her. As children in grammar school, they had practiced air raid drills when the teacher clapped her hands and said, "The town whistle is blowing." You were supposed to crawl under your desk and put your hands over your head and wait, either for the all clear or for enemy missiles to blow you to powder. Now, in her mind, as clearly as a leaf pressed in plastic, the town whistle is blowing. She heard the words clang in her mind. Far below, to the left, where the high school parking lot was, the ring of sodium arc lamps made it a sure landmark, although the school building itself was invisible in the dark. A spark glowed as if God had struck a flint and steel. That's where the oil tanks are. The spark hesitated, then bloomed orange. Now you could see the school, and it was on fire. So you have a lot of senses at play here, and that's very good writing. You have the visual of the school, of the darkness, of the bloom of orange. You have the sound of the air raids. You have the one thing that's interesting here is that memory is not technically a sense, but I think that you would probably describe it much in the same way that you would describe a sense's usefulness in your life. Throwing in memories to your writing for your characters makes them multidimensional as well. So you have Sue, who's using her memory, who is seeing things, who is hearing things. You can feel almost putting your hands over your head. You have the temperature with the where is it here? The breath forming condensation on the window. You have all sorts of things going on that just enrapture the reader through the use of senses. The next thing that we have to take here is adverbs. Page 224. Her head throbbed thickly, and conscious thought was lost. Thickly? How does your head throb thickly? Now, obviously, it's not the worst writing in the world, but I do want to use this as a moment to talk about adverbs, because Stephen King himself talked about adverbs. We have a quote here from On Writing by Stephen King, definitely worth the investment, definitely worth the read, especially if you are a writer. He said, "I believe the road to hell is paved with adverbs, and I will shout it from the rooftops. To put it another way, they're like dandelions. If you have one on your lawn, it looks pretty and unique. If you fail to root it out, however, you find 5 the next day, 50 the day after that, and then, my brothers and sisters, your lawn is totally, completely, and profligately covered with dandelions." See what he did there? By then, you see them for the weeds they really are. But by then, gasp, it's too late. So that is an interesting way to put it for Stephen King. The one thing I normally say about adverbs is when you use an adverb, you rob the reader of some experience. If you were to say, for example, he punched the brick wall repeatedly. Yeah, we know what that means. I can see it. I don't know exactly what we're looking at. But if you say he struck the brick wall as hard as he could, splitting his middle knuckle, again, and that knuckle was swollen, he struck the brick wall a third time, and he did not feel the pain any longer. That does a whole lot more for your reader. That tells you a whole lot more about that character. That tells you a whole lot more about where that character is. And the final thing I want to talk about with the Writer's Corner portion of this video is this. This section of the novel is basically the same story being told a few different times from a few different points of view. Maybe that works for you, maybe it doesn't. It is difficult for me to believe that something like this really gets published today. I think that this is something, so I think it's effective-ish in Carrie. I think that we're adding to the experience. We're maybe not adding to the literature of the thing by getting the same story over again from different perspectives, but we're certainly adding to the experience. The thing that I wonder, so I don't know how you feel about Elon Musk. He's someone that I find infinitely interesting. One of the things he says about Tesla, his company Tesla, is that he spends a lot of time worrying whether or not they would hire Nikola Tesla. Nikola Tesla probably would not have interviewed well. Nikola Tesla probably would not have the right degree. Nikola Tesla probably would come across a little bit like a crazy person. Nikola Tesla did so much incredible work that Elon Musk named his company after Nikola Tesla. I feel very much the same way about a lot of creative writing. This is a pretty good experience. Is it the most literary novel in the world? No. It's pretty decent for it. It's certainly decent as far as the horror genre goes. But it's not... It's a good experience. Would this novel be published today with this middle chapter, the big long chapter in the middle of this novel, chapter 2 of 3, this part of the novel basically being the same thing told over and over and over again? I fear this is something that the creative writing programs across the nation would stamp out. I fear the Stephen Kings of the world today are not published. I fear the Stephen Kings of today don't even submit things. I don't know how to really get an entire talking point out of that. I don't know how to make a resolution for that talking point. It's just something that strikes me quite often. She began to run, breathing deep in her chest, running from Tommy, from the fires and explosions, from Carrie, but mostly from the final horror. That last lighted thought carried swiftly down into the black tunnel of eternity, followed by the blank, idiot hum of prosaic electricity. The after-image began to fade reluctantly, leaving a blessed, cool darkness in her mind that knew nothing. She slowed, halted, and became aware that something had begun to happen. She stood in the middle of the great and misty field, waiting for realization. Her rapid breathing slowed, caught suddenly as if on a thorn, and suddenly vented itself in one howling, cheated scream as she felt the slow course of dark menstrual blood down her thighs.